Captain Rebecca Hawk Martinez stood at attention in the sterile conference room at Camp Pendleton, her flight suit crisp despite the California heat beating down outside. The morning sun filtered through Venetian blinds, casting sharp lines. Across the polished table where 3 senior officers sat in judgment, Colonel James Whitmore, a man whose gray mustache seemed permanently fixed in a disapproving frown, shuffled through a stack of papers. His weathered hands, marked by decades of military service, moved with deliberate slowness. To his left sat Major Patricia Wells, her sharp eyes never leaving Rebecca's face. To his right, Lieutenant Colonel David Harrison tapped his pen against the table in an irritating rhythm. Captain Martinez, Colonel Whitmore began, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through 30 years of service. "Do you understand why you're here?" Rebecca's jaw tightened slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Yes, sir. The incident during last week's training exercise." "Incident?" Major Wells leaned forward, her voice rising. "Captain, you flew your helicopter 15 feet below the designated altitude. You performed unauthorized maneuvers that put your crew and ground personnel at risk. That's not an incident, that's reckless endangerment." The words hit Rebecca like physical blows, but she kept her composure. She had been flying helicopters for 8 years, had completed 2 tours in Afghanistan, and had never lost a single soldier under her command. Her record was spotless until last Tuesday. "Ma'am, with respect, I was responding to changing wind conditions. The altitude adjustment was necessary to show off." Lieutenant Colonel Harrison interrupted, his pen now still. "We have reports from ground crew that you were performing maneuvers that weren't part of the exercise. Hot-dogging, some called it." Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks. Hot-dogging, the term stung because it reduced her split-second decision-making and years of experience to teenage recklessness. She had adjusted her flight path to avoid a sudden downdraft that could have slammed her bird into the ground. But explaining wind shear and rotor wash to officers who hadn't been in a cockpit in years felt impossible. "Sir, I was maintaining safety margins while completing the mission objectives. The weather conditions changed rapidly, and I adapted accordingly." Colonel Whitmore removed his reading glasses and fixed her with a stare that had probably intimidated countless soldiers. "Over the years, Captain Martinez, I've been in this military for 3 decades. I've seen pilots like you before, young, talented, but convinced that rules don't apply to them. Your father was the same way." The mention of her father struck deep. Colonel Roberto Martinez had been a legend in the Marine Corps, a pilot whose skill was matched only by his strict adherence to protocol. He had died in a training accident when Rebecca was 12, a tragedy that had shaped her entire life and career path. "My father, sir, always followed regulations to the letter." "Your father," Major Wells interjected, "also knew when to take calculated risks and when to follow orders without question. This incident suggests you haven't learned that distinction." Rebecca's hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she kept them hidden behind her back. 8 years of service, hundreds of successful missions, lives saved, and it all came down to 30 seconds of flying that these desk officers called reckless. The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of helicopters conducting morning exercises outside. Through the window, Rebecca could see her own bird, a UH-1Y Venom, sitting idle on the tarmac. Her crew chief, Sergeant Mike Johnson, was performing routine maintenance, probably wondering why his pilot was stuck in this room instead of flying. "Captain Martinez," Colonel Whitmore continued, effective immediately. "You are grounded pending a full investigation into your conduct. You will surrender your flight authorization to Major Wells and report to administrative duties until further notice." The words hit harder than any physical blow. Grounded. For a pilot, it was like being told to stop breathing. Rebecca had dreamed of flying since she was 5 years old, inspired by stories of her father's heroics. She had worked twice as hard as her male counterparts in flight school, endured countless comments about women not belonging in combat roles, and proved herself time and again in the most dangerous situations imaginable. "Sir, I request the opportunity to present additional evidence regarding the weather conditions that day. The meteorological reports will show the decision is final." "Captain," Major Wells stood, her hand extended for Rebecca's flight credentials. "Your recklessness has consequences. Perhaps some time on the ground will help you remember that." Rebecca slowly reached into her chest pocket and withdrew the small laminated card that represented everything she had worked for. Her flight authorization, the physical proof of her qualification to command a multi-million-dollar aircraft and the lives of her crew. She placed it in Major Wells' palm, feeling like she was surrendering a piece of her soul. "You're dismissed," Captain Colonel Whitmore said without looking up from his papers. Rebecca executed a perfect about-face and marched toward the door, her boots clicking against the polished floor. As she reached for the handle, she heard Lieutenant Colonel Harrison mutter to his colleagues. Maybe now she learned that being Roberto Martinez's daughter doesn't make her untouchable. The words followed her into the hallway, where the administrative bustle of the base continued around her. Young Marines hurried past with folders and urgent expressions, unaware that one of their most experienced pilots had just been stripped of the very thing that defined her. Outside, the California sun felt different, somehow harsher, less welcoming. The sound of helicopters taking off and landing, which had always been music to her ears, now felt like a taunt. She walked slowly toward the administrative building where she would spend her days processing paperwork, instead of saving lives. Sergeant Johnson approached from across the tarmac, his weathered face creased with concern. At 52, he had been maintaining helicopters longer than Rebecca had been alive, and he had an uncanny ability to read people's moods. "Captain, everything all right? We've got the bird ready for the training run in 20 minutes. Rebecca stopped walking and turned to face him. This was the hardest part, telling her crew that their pilot had been deemed unfit to fly. Johnson had served with her father and had specifically requested assignment to her unit when she graduated from flight school. He believed in her abilities more than anyone. "Sergeant, cancel the training run. I'd been grounded pending investigation." Johnson's expression shifted from concern to disbelief. "Grounded you, ma'am, with respect. That's the biggest load of Sergeant Johnson," Rebecca interrupted gently. "It's done. Major Wells will assign a temporary pilot to the unit." The older man shook his head slowly. "Captain, I've been working on birds for 30 years. I've seen pilots who couldn't find their way out of a paper bag get promoted, and I've seen the best stick-and-rooter pilots in the corps get railroaded by politics. This isn't about your flying." Rebecca knew he was right, but knowing didn't make it hurt less. "Maybe it's time for me to think about what comes next." "What comes next is you proving them wrong," Johnson said firmly. "Your father would have said the same thing." As Rebecca walked away toward her new reality of desk duty and administrative tasks, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just punishment for aggressive flying. The way Major Wells had smiled when taking her credentials, the carefully coordinated nature of the review board, the immediate grounding without opportunity for appeal, it all felt personal. Behind her, Johnson continued his maintenance work, but his movements were sharp with anger. He had seen politics destroy good pilots before, but never one as skilled as Rebecca Martinez. As he tightened bolts and checked fluid levels, he muttered under his breath about officers who wouldn't know a helicopter from a ceiling fan, making decisions about the best pilot he had ever worked with. The sun climbed higher over Camp Pendleton, marking the end of Rebecca's flying career and the beginning of a chain of events that would test everything she believed about honor, duty, and the true meaning of service. 3 weeks into her administrative exile, Captain Rebecca Martinez sat behind a metal desk in Building 1403, processing insurance claims, reviewing maintenance schedules, and filing incident reports had become her new reality. The windowless office smelled of coffee stains and bureaucracy, a sharp contrast to the open skies she used to call home. The morning routine had become painfully predictable. Arrive at 0700, review overnight reports, process supply requisitions, attend meetings about meetings, and try to ignore the sound of helicopters taking off outside. Each rotor beat felt like a personal reminder of what she had lost. Master Sergeant Linda Hayes, the administrative head of the Motorpool Division, had taken pity on Rebecca and included her in the daily operations briefings. It was charity, really a way to make a grounded pilot feel useful. But Rebecca threw herself into the work with the same intensity she had once reserved for flying. "Martinez, you've got visitors," Sergeant Hayes announced from the doorway, her voice carrying a hint of curiosity. Rebecca looked up from a stack of vehicle maintenance reports to see two familiar faces. Captain Tommy Rodriguez and Captain Jessica Warner, both helicopter pilots from her squadron. Tommy's easy smile and Jessica's concerned expression told her this wasn't a social visit. "Mind if we sit?" Tommy asked, already pulling up a chair. His flight suit bore the insignia of the commanding officer of Helicopter Squadron 262, a position he had earned through political savvy as much as flying skill. "What brings the aerial elite to the land of paperwork?" Rebecca asked, trying to keep her tone light despite the knot forming in her stomach. Jessica leaned forward, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. "Beck, we need to talk about what really happened during that training exercise." Rebecca's hands stilled on the papers. She had replayed that flight 1,000 times in her mind, analyzing every decision, every control input, every split-second choice that had led to her downfall. What about it? I made a judgment call about altitude and wind conditions. The review board disagreed with my assessment. Tommy shook his head. It's more complicated than that. Jessica and I have been asking questions, talking to ground crew, reviewing weather data from that day, and, Rebecca prompted, though part of her didn't want to hear the answer. The weather station recorded a sudden wind shear event at exactly the time you made your altitude adjustment, Jessica said, pulling out a folded meteorological report. Winds shifted 40 degrees and increased by 15 knots in less than 30 seconds. If you hadn't dropped altitude when you did, you would have been caught in a downdraft that could have been catastrophic. Rebecca stared at the report, feeling a mixture of vindication and anger. Where was this information during my review board? That's the problem, Tommy said, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by serious concern. This report was filed after your hearing. Someone made sure it wasn't available when you needed it. The implications hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Someone had deliberately withheld evidence that would have exonerated her. Someone wanted her grounded, wanted her out of the cockpit badly enough to manipulate the system. Who would do this, and why? Jessica and Tommy exchanged glances. It was Jessica who spoke first. Major Wells has been pushing for changes in squadron leadership. She's been vocal about her belief that combat aviation units need more mature, less aggressive leadership, meaning older male pilots instead of young women, Rebecca translated bitterly. There's more, Tommy continued. 3 other female pilots in the wing have been written up for minor infractions in the past 6 months. Nothing as serious as your case, but a pattern of increased scrutiny. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, the pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to form in her mind. Her grounding wasn't about reckless flying. It was about eliminating obstacles to someone's vision of how military aviation should look. What do you want me to do about it? I'm stuck here processing paperwork while someone else flies my bird. Fight back, Jessica said simply. Appeal the decision. Demand a new hearing with all the evidence. With what? My word against 3 senior officers. They'll say I'm being vindictive, that I can't accept responsibility for my actions. Tommy pulled out his phone and showed her a video file. What about this? The screen showed helmet camera footage from one of the other helicopters in the training exercise. Rebecca watched herself execute the altitude change she had been crucified for, but from the external perspective, she could see what the review board had missed. Her helicopter encountered a visible downdraft, dust and debris swirling up from the ground as the wind patterns shifted. Her quick descent had avoided a potentially deadly encounter with wind shear. Where did you get this? Lieutenant Davis, from Squadron 265, was flying wing that day. He just came forward after hearing about your grounding. Apparently, his conscience finally got the better of him. Rebecca studied the footage, seeing her own actions vindicated by an objective camera. But she also saw something else: the precise timing of her maneuver. The way she had anticipated the wind shift before it fully developed. It wasn't recklessness. It was the kind of instinctive flying that came from years of experience and natural ability. This changes everything, she said quietly. It should, Jessica agreed. But you need to be careful about how you use it. Major Wells has allies, and they won't appreciate being proven wrong. Over the next several days, Rebecca threw herself into building a case for appeal. She contacted the base meteorologist, reviewed maintenance logs from her helicopter, and interviewed ground crew members who had witnessed the flight. The picture that emerged was clear. She had made the right call under dangerous conditions, and someone had gone to great lengths to paint it as recklessness. But the more she investigated, the more resistance she encountered. The meteor suddenly became unavailable for interviews. Ground crew members were reassigned to different shifts. Even Lieutenant Davis, who had provided the crucial helmet camera footage, was deployed on an unexpected training mission to Nevada. The message was clear: drop the appeal or face consequences. Rebecca's breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon while processing a routine supply request. She overheard 2 junior officers talking in the hallway about the hotshot female pilot who finally got put in her place. The casual dismissal of her career and reputation by people who had never set foot in a combat zone ignited something deep inside her that evening. She called her mentor, retired Colonel Patricia Mendoza, who had been one of the first female helicopter pilots in the Marine Corps. Mendoza listened patiently as Rebecca explained the situation, occasionally asking pointed questions about evidence and witnesses. Rebecca Mendoza said when the story was complete, "I've been where you are. Different decade, same prejudices. You have two choices: accept this injustice and find a new career path, or fight it with everything you have. What would you do? I'd remember that sometimes the system needs to be challenged, even when the cost is high. Your father would have said the same thing. That night, Rebecca sat in her small apartment off base, surrounded by evidence of her innocence and documentation of what appeared to be a systematic campaign against female aviators. The smart career move would be to accept the grounding, serve out her remaining years in administrative roles, and retire quietly. But as she looked at the photograph on her desk, her father in his flight suit, standing next to his helicopter, she knew what she had to do. The next morning, Rebecca walked into the base legal office and filed a formal appeal of her grounding. She requested a new review board, demanded access to all weather data from the day in question, and formally accused Major Wells of withholding evidence during the original hearing. The legal officer, Captain David Kim, reviewed her paperwork with increasing concern. Captain Martinez, these are serious allegations. If you're wrong about this, it could end your career entirely. Captain Kim, Rebecca replied, my career is already over unless I fight for it. As she left the legal office, Rebecca felt a mixture of fear and determination. She had declared war on a system that had tried to silence her, and there would be no backing down. But she also knew that powerful people would not appreciate being challenged, and the consequences of her actions were impossible to predict. Walking across the base toward her administrative office, she noticed more helicopters in the air than usual. Training exercises were intensifying, and somewhere in the back of her mind, she wondered if her grounding had left the squadron short-handed at exactly the wrong time. The sound of rotors filled the air, and for the first time in weeks, Rebecca allowed herself to imagine being back in the cockpit where she belonged. 2 days after filing her appeal, Captain Rebecca Martinez arrived at work to find her desk cleared and a note directing her to report to Colonel Whitmore's office immediately. The walk across space felt like a march to execution, but Rebecca kept her shoulders squared and her expression neutral. Colonel Whitmore's office was a shrine to military aviation history. Model helicopters lined the shelves, and photographs of distinguished pilots covered the walls. Notably absent was any image of her father, despite his legendary status in Marine Corps aviation. Sit down, Captain Whitmore said, without looking up from his paperwork. His tone carried the weight of barely controlled anger. Rebecca took the offered chair and waited. Years of military training had taught her the power of silence. Your appeal has created quite a stir, Whitmore continued, finally raising his eyes to meet hers. Accusations of evidence tampering, claims of systematic bias against female aviators, demands for new hearings. You've made some powerful people very unhappy, sir. I'm simply requesting that all evidence be considered in my case. Are you? Whitmore leaned back in his chair. Or are you trying to deflect blame for your own poor judgment by manufacturing a conspiracy? The word manufacturing stung, but Rebecca had prepared for this attack. Sir, I have documented evidence that meteorological data supporting my actions was available but not presented during my original hearing. That data was filed after your hearing concluded. It had no bearing on the decisions you made in the cockpit. With respect, sir, that's not accurate. Rebecca pulled out a folder she had prepared. The weather station's preliminary reports were available within 2 hours of the incident. The formal report was delayed, but the raw data that exonerates my actions was accessible to the investigation team. Whitmore's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Captain Martinez, you're walking down a dangerous path. Your original punishment was administrative, a temporary grounding while we evaluated your judgment. Keep pushing this conspiracy theory, and you'll face court-martial proceedings. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a crashed aircraft, but Rebecca had come too far to back down now. Sir, I'm confident that a thorough investigation will support my appeal. Then you're about to be disappointed. Whitmore stood and walked to his window where the flight line was visible. Several helicopters were conducting training exercises, their rotors creating dust devils on the tarmac. Captain Martinez, let me be clear. Your father was a fine pilot, but he was also a man who understood chain of command and respect for authority. You seem to have inherited his flying ability but not his wisdom. The comparison to her father was meant to wound, and it succeeded, but it also strengthened Rebecca's resolve. She knew what kind of man her father had been: principled, courageous, and unwilling to accept injustice. Sir, my father taught me that integrity means doing the right thing even when it's difficult. Your father is dead, Captain, and if you continue down this path, your career will be too. The dismissal was clear, but as Rebecca stood to leave, Whitmore delivered one final blow. Oh, and Captain, you're being transferred. Effective Monday, you'll be reporting to Logistics Command in Barstow. I'm sure you'll find inventory management, educational Barstow. The assignment was clearly punitive, a remote desert base where pilots went to die professionally. It was far from any combat units, isolated from advancement opportunities, and generally considered career purgatory. Rebecca left Whitmore's office with her orders in hand and her future looking bleaker than ever. But as she walked back to her temporary desk, she noticed increased activity around the base. Helicopters were launching more frequently, and there was an urgency in the air that suggested something beyond routine training. That afternoon, she encountered Sergeant Johnson in the mess hall. The older man looked exhausted, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by worry. "Sergeant, you look like you haven't slept in days." Johnson glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard, then leaned closer. "Captain, they've got us running non-stop exercises. Something's brewing, but nobody's talking about what." "What kind of exercises?" "Combat search and rescue scenarios, deep penetration flights, night operations in hostile territory, simulation." Johnson paused, then added quietly, "And they're pushing pilots beyond normal rotation schedules. Your replacement, Lieutenant Morrison, has been flying double shifts." Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Morrison was a competent pilot but inexperienced in combat situations. If the squadron was being pushed to operational limits with under-trained personnel, it was a recipe for disaster. "Sergeant, I need you to do something for me, but it has to stay between us." Johnson nodded without hesitation. "Anything, Captain. Keep track of flight hours, crew rest violations, any safety concerns. Document everything. Something tells me we're going to need that information." That evening, Rebecca received an unexpected visitor at her apartment. Captain Jessica Warner arrived looking nervous and constantly checking over her shoulder. "Beck, we need to talk privately." They sat in Rebecca's small living room, speaking in hushed tones despite being alone. "The investigation into your appeal is being handled by Major Wells," Jessica began. "The same person who grounded you is now in charge of determining whether you were wrongfully grounded. That's a conflict of interest. It gets worse. I've been asking questions about the other female pilots who were written up recently. 2 of them have requested transfers out of combat aviation. The third is being encouraged to consider a medical discharge for issues." Rebecca felt sick. They're systematically removing women from combat roles and replacing them with less experienced male pilots at exactly the time when operational tempo is increasing. Jessica pulled out a small notebook. "I've been tracking assignments. In the past 3 months, 6 experienced female aviators have been removed from combat-ready status. Their replacements average 2 years less flight experience. Why? What's driving this? Politics? Budget concerns? Old school thinking about women in combat?" Jessica shrugged. "Does it matter? The result is the same. Experienced pilots are being replaced with less capable ones right when the military needs its best people." Rebecca stared out her apartment window at the base in the distance. Lights were still on in many buildings despite the late hour, and she could hear the occasional helicopter landing or taking off. "Jessica, I need you to promise me something. If something happens, if there's an incident, casualties, anything, make sure the real story gets told. Don't let them bury the truth about why experienced pilots were grounded." "What are you planning?" "I'm going to Barstow as ordered, but I'm also going to keep fighting this appeal, even if it destroys my career." Jessica reached over and squeezed Rebecca's hand. "Your father would be proud." "I hope so, because I'm about to find out how much integrity really costs." The next morning brought unexpected news. The base buzzer system crackled to life at 0530, earlier than usual, with an announcement that chilled everyone who heard it. "All personnel, attention, effective immediately. Combat Search and Rescue Squadron 262 is on operational alert status. All leave is cancelled. Flight crews report to briefing immediately." Rebecca heard the announcement from her apartment and felt her heart sink. Operational alert meant real-world missions, not training exercises. Somewhere, American service members were in danger, and her squadron now, flying with less experienced pilots, because she and others had been removed, was being called upon to save them. She dressed quickly and drove to base, not knowing what she could do but unable to stay away. As she arrived at the main gate, she saw the frantic activity of a unit preparing for combat operations. Helicopters were being armed and fueled, crews were running pre-flight checks, and there was an electric tension in the air that she recognized from her combat deployments. At the squadron building, she found chaos. Pilots were studying maps, ground crews were loading equipment, and officers were huddled around communication equipment, receiving mission briefings. Through a window, she saw Lieutenant Morrison looking pale and overwhelmed as he received his first real-world combat mission briefing. Next to him, several other pilots who had been fast-tracked into combat roles to replace the grounded female aviators looked equally unprepared. Rebecca realized with growing horror that her appeal, her fight for justice, might have come at exactly the wrong time. Somewhere, American lives were in danger, and the people being sent to save them were flying with a squadron that had been deliberately weakened by politics and prejudice. She didn't know it yet, but 8 Marines trapped behind enemy lines in a classified location were about to depend on the very pilots who had replaced her and her female colleagues, and the mission that was about to unfold would prove, in the most dramatic way possible, the cost of prioritizing politics over competence. At 0330 hours, 8 Marines from Recon Team Alpha were supposed to be extracted from a hilltop observation post in a classified location near the Syrian border. Instead, they were pinned down by enemy fire. Their extraction helicopter smoking in a ravine 2 clicks away, and their radio reporting that rescue was at least 4 hours out. Marcus Thompson pressed himself against the rocky outcropping that provided their only cover and checked his watch. Dawn was breaking, which meant their concealment was about to disappear. Around him, his team maintained defensive positions despite dwindling ammunition and the growing certainty that they wouldn't see home again. "Sergeant, we've got movement on the eastern ridge," whispered Corporal James Riley, the team's youngest member at barely 22 years old. Thompson crawled to Riley's position and peered through binoculars at the enemy forces moving to surround their position. Local militia, well armed and clearly coordinated. They had stumbled into what was supposed to be a simple observation mission and found themselves in the middle of a hornet's nest. "How many?" Thompson asked. "At least 30, maybe more coming." From the north, Thompson keyed his radio. "Overwatch base, this is Recon Alpha. Enemy forces are moving to surround our position. We need immediate extraction, over." The reply crackled through static. "Recon Alpha, Overwatch base. Rescue mission is en route. Estimated arrival, your position 45 minutes. Can you hold?" Thompson looked around at his Marines. 3 were. Wounded ammunition was running low, and they were outnumbered at least 4 to 1. "We'll hold Overwatch, but make it quick." What Thompson didn't know was that the rescue mission was being flown by pilots who had never worked together before, led by Lieutenant Morrison, who had fewer than 50 hours of combat flight time. The experienced aviators who should have been flying this mission were sitting at desks or transferring to non-combat roles because they had been deemed too aggressive or unsuitable for military aviation. Back at Camp Pendleton, Captain Rebecca Martinez was not supposed to be on base at 0330, but she had been unable to sleep. The operational alert had kept her awake, wondering about the mission her former squadron was flying. She had driven to base and was sitting in her car in the parking lot, listening to radio chatter on a scanner she had borrowed from Sergeant Johnson. The fragments of communication painted a grim picture. A combat search and rescue mission had gone wrong. Ground forces were in contact with the enemy. The rescue helicopter had been damaged during the initial extraction attempt and was unable to complete the mission. All stations, this is Overwatch base. We have 8 Marines in immediate danger. Repeat, 8 Marines need emergency extraction from hot landing zone." Rebecca's hands gripped the steering wheel. 8 Marines. Her squadron was being asked to fly into a combat zone to save 8 American lives, and they were doing it with pilots who had been fast-tracked into positions they weren't ready for. Through her car radio, she heard Lieutenant Morrison's voice, tight with stress and uncertainty. "Overwatch base. This is Rescue 1, we're encountering heavy ground fire. Unable to establish secure landing zone. Rescue 1, you need to complete this mission. Those Marines won't survive another hour." Rebecca could hear the fear in Morrison's voice, and her heart broke for the young pilot, who was being asked to perform a mission that would challenge even the most experienced aviators. She grabbed her cell phone and called Sergeant Johnson. "Sergeant, where are you?" "At the flight line, Captain. They've got me prepping backup aircraft in case the primary mission fails. I need to get on base now." "Captain, you're grounded. If they catch you anywhere near operational aircraft, 8 Marines are going to die because inexperienced pilots are flying a mission they're not prepared for. I need to be there." Johnson was quiet for a long moment. "Building 1403 has an unguarded entrance on the east side. I can meet you there in 10 minutes. Rebecca drove through the base with her headlights off. using backroads she had learned during 8 years of service. The flight line was illuminated by emergency lighting, and she could see 3 helicopters preparing for launch. One bore the scars of battle-damaged the failed rescue attempt. Johnson met her at the designated building and handed her a flight suit and helmet. "Captain, if you're caught, I never saw you." "Understood. What's the tactical situation?" 8 Marines trapped on a hilltop. First rescue attempt was turned back by heavy ground fire. Morrison is leading the second attempt with 2 wingmen, but he's never flown a combat rescue before. Rebecca listened to the radio traffic as Morrison's formation approached the target area. His communications were textbook correct but lacked the instinctive confidence that came from experience. He was flying by procedures rather than intuition, and in combat, that difference could be fatal. Rescue 1, this is Recon Alpha. Enemy forces are closing our position. We need immediate extraction. Recon Alpha, we're taking heavy fire. Attempting to identify secure landing zone. Rebecca could hear the problem in Morrison's voice. He was trying to find a perfect landing zone that didn't exist. In combat rescue, you often had to accept risk and improvise solutions that weren't in any manual. "Johnson, I need to get to the communications center." "Captain, that's restricted area during operational missions. Those Marines are going to die if someone doesn't help Morrison think outside the box." They moved through the base using maintenance corridors and emergency routes Rebecca had learned during her years of service. The communication center was bustling with activity as officers coordinated the rescue attempt and monitored the deteriorating situation. Rebecca slipped into the back of the room and listened to the real-time communication between the trapped Marines and the rescue formation. The situation was getting worse by the minute. "Rescue 1, we're down to emergency ammunition. Enemy forces are within 50 meters of our position." Morrison's response revealed his inexperience. "Recon Alpha, we cannot establish a secure landing zone. Requesting permission to abort mission and return to base for reinforcements." The silence that followed was deafening. Aborting the mission meant leaving 8 Marines to die. But Morrison was paralyzed by the impossible choice between risking his crew and abandoning fellow Americans. Rebecca stepped forward, knowing that her career was about to end, but unable to remain silent while Marines died. "Morrison, this is Martinez. I'm monitoring your frequency." The communication center fell silent. Officers turned to stare at the grounded pilot who was not supposed to be on base, let alone interfering with an active mission. "Martinez, I thought you would listen to me carefully. Morrison, you need to execute a combat descent approach from the northeast. Use the ridgeline for concealment, then pop up at the last second. It's dangerous, but it's the only way to avoid the ground fire." "Martinez, I can't. That's not standard procedure. It's not in the manual because it requires judgment and experience. Trust me on this." Before anyone could stop her, Rebecca continued with the precise instructions that could save 8 Marines and 3 helicopter crews. Her voice carried the confidence of experience and the desperation of someone watching her fellow Americans die because politics had replaced competence with inexperience. But as she spoke, she saw Colonel Whitmore enter the communication center, his face dark with rage at finding the grounded pilot interfering with his mission. The next few minutes would determine whether 8 Marines lived or died, and whether Rebecca Martinez would face court-martial for the crime of trying to save them. "Captain Martinez, step away from that radio immediately." Colonel Whitmore's voice cut through the communication center like a blade, but Rebecca didn't move. 8 Marines were dying while politics played out in an air-conditioned room. "Morrison, listen to me," Rebecca continued, ignoring the colonel's order. "The terrain gives you one shot at this. Approach from the northeast at 200 feet. Use the waddy for concealment, then execute a combat approach. Pop up fast, land hot, and get those Marines out." "Martinez." Whitmore started toward her, but Major Patricia Wells, who had been monitoring the failing rescue, held up a hand to stop him. "Let her talk," Wells said quietly. "Morrison's in over his head, and those Marines are going to die." On the radio, Morrison's voice crackled with uncertainty. "Martinez, I've never flown a combat approach. What if I mess it up? Then you learn fast, or we lose 8 good Marines." Rebecca's voice softened slightly. "Morrison, you've got the skills. Trust your training and trust your instincts. I'll talk you through it." Through the radio, they could all hear the desperate voice of Staff Sergeant Thompson from the hilltop. Any station, this is Recon Alpha. We are being overrun. Immediate extraction required, or we are KIA." The brutal clarity of the Marines' words settled over the communication center like a shroud. These weren't training statistics or administrative problems. They were 8 Americans, about to die because the system had prioritized politics over competence. Rebecca keyed the radio again. Morrison, execute approach now. Descend to 200 feet, heading 045 degrees. Use the terrain to mask your approach. Roger, descending to 200 feet. On the tactical display, they could see Morrison's helicopter beginning its approach. The terrain was treacherous, rocky hills, deep ravines, and limited landing